They tore up the will right in front of me. I got a box of junk. Inside, it was everything that would turn my life upside down. But back then, I had no clue. Well, almost no clue. Let me paint you a picture of that day. Picture this. A living room that smelled like old furniture polish and disappointment, filled with relatives who hadn't spoken to each other in years, but suddenly found themselves united by one common goal, dividing up Grandpa's stuff like vultures picking at roadkill. Their smiles were shining like Christmas lights, but without a single spark of warmth behind them. Pure ritual hypocrisy at its finest. My dad was there, of course. Mom, too. My brother Jake sat in the corner, already counting his chickens before they hatched. The lawyer, this tired-looking guy in a wrinkled suit who probably handled more family drama than a reality TV producer, spread out papers on Grandpa's old coffee table, like he was dealing cards in Vegas. It felt like I'd stumbled into a play where I didn't know my lines, and everyone else had rehearsed betrayal. Here we were, supposedly mourning Grandpa, but everyone was eyeing his possessions like they were shopping at a Black Friday sale. I kept thinking about how Grandpa used to sit in that exact same chair where the lawyer now sat, telling me stories about his old days, his weather hands always moving as he talked. Those hands that taught me how to tie fishing knots, how to fix a leaky faucet, how to be a man when nobody else bothered to show me. Life's gonna knock you down, kiddo, he used to say while showing me how to tie a proper bowline knot. The trick is learning how to get back up with your dignity intact. But that was then. This was now. And now sucked. The lawyer cleared his throat, one of those official sounds that means time for business, and started reading. Jake got the house. Mom and Dad split the investments. Some distant cousin I barely knew got Grandpa's truck. They were passing around his life like it was takeout food, and everybody was getting their portion except me. Then came the moment that still makes my stomach turn. Dad looked at me with this expression, you know the one, like he was about to tell a kid there's no Santa Claus, and said the words that would echo in my head for years. No money for your stupid dreams, son. Just like that. No money for college. No money for the future I've been planning since I was 15. No money for anything that mattered to me. Meanwhile, Jake, golden boy Jake, who'd never worked a day in his life, got handed a check for $100,000 for his education expenses. The lawyer practically patted him on the head, like a good dog getting a treat. It was like watching someone pour liquid gold on one person while telling the other to be grateful for the puddle on the floor. Those $100,000 felt like a golden rain shower for Jake, while my dreams became just a droplet on glass, easily wiped away with one dismissive gesture. The betrayal hit different when you're 18 and stupid enough to still believe your family has your back. This wasn't just a cold shower. This was a frozen waterfall that washed away every last illusion I had about family loyalty. I sat there, trying to process how the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally could dismiss my entire future like it was a bad joke they'd heard too many times. But then something happened that gave me a sliver of hope. When the lawyer opened the last folder, I held my breath. Maybe Grandpa's old camera? His vinyl record player? Something. Anything that showed he remembered I existed? The folder was empty. Nothing but air and disappointment. It was like someone opened a treasure chest just to show me the dust inside. Dad's disgusted look made it even worse, followed by those words that still sting. Take this junk and get lost. The junk was a cardboard box that had seen better decades. Inside, Grandpa's reading glasses with scratched lenses, some old books that smelled like basement, a few faded photographs in his leather wallet. Beaten up but still holding together, just like he always was. That wallet smelled like history, like something warm and forgotten. I always thought it was just a leather archive of his life. The irony would hit me later. So there I was, 18 years old, holding a box of what my family considered worthless while they divided up everything valuable. The message was crystal clear. I was a family afterthought, the leftover nobody wanted to deal with. The first night on my own was something else. I found this room, and I use the term room generously, above a Chinese restaurant downtown. The smell of grease and soy sauce seeped through the floorboards, mixing with the musty odor of old carpet and broken dreams. The walls were so thin, I could hear my neighbor's television, his snoring, probably his thoughts if I listened hard enough. That first night without family was so lonely that even the mice in the walls seemed to pity me. They offered companionship with their scratching and scurrying while I ate leftover lo mein and wondered how my life had taken such a sharp turn into nowhere. The room was so cold I could see my breath, and the radiator made sounds like it was dying a slow, painful death. I got a job washing dishes at a 24-hour diner called Mel's, the kind of place where dreams about higher education go to die, smashed against plates covered in other people's leftovers. My hands constantly smelled like industrial soap and desperation. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like angry bees, and the floor was always sticky no matter how much I mopped it. The work was mind-numbing. Scrub, rinse, repeat. Scrub, rinse, repeat. Hour after hour cleaning up other people's messes, while my own life felt like the biggest mess of all. The manager, this guy named Pete who looked like he'd been working there since the place opened in 1967, kept telling me I was lucky to have a job. Lucky, right. But here's the thing about hitting rock bottom. You start noticing things you missed before, like how the other dishwashers were mostly guys like me, young and forgotten, grinding through night shift because nobody else would hire them. We formed this weird brotherhood of the overlooked, sharing cigarettes during breaks and complaining about everything except the thing that really bothered us. Feeling invisible, the weeks blurred together. Wake up at 6 p.m., work until 6 a.m., sleep until noon, repeat. It was like being trapped in some weird time loop, where progress was measured in dirty plates cleaned and barely enough money earned to keep the lights on. Every morning when I walked home, the sunrise felt like mockery. Another day survived, but for what? I kept Grandpa's box in the corner of my room, like some kind of shrine to better times. Sometimes, when the loneliness got too heavy, I'd go through his things. The photographs mostly showed him when he was young, before life wore him down. There was one of him in his army uniform, standing next to a Jeep with a grin, so wide you'd think he'd just won the war himself. I'd never seen him smile like that in real life. Another showed him dancing with Grandma at their wedding. She passed when I was 10, but in that picture, they looked like they had forever ahead of them. His reading glasses still had smudges on them. I never cleaned them off. Somehow it felt wrong, like erasing the last traces of him actually using them. The books were mostly westerns and war stories, with pages yellowed and corners folded down where he'd stopped reading. His handwriting filled the margins with little notes and observations. But that wallet, man, that wallet was something special. The leather was worn smooth in places where his hands had touched it thousands of times. It still held his driver's license, a few business cards from places that probably didn't exist anymore, and a photograph of me from my high school graduation. Seeing that photo hit me like a truck. He'd kept in his wallet, carried it around like I actually mattered to him. The wallet was practically falling apart, held together by habit and stubborn leather that refused to give up. Just like Grandpa himself, I guess. It had this smell, Old Spice aftershave mixed with tobacco, and something else I couldn't identify. Something that just smelled like him. 3 weeks into my new life as a professional nobody, I hit what felt like my absolute lowest point. I'd worked a double shift because someone called in sick, my feet were killing me, and I'd burned my hand on a pot that was hotter than it looked. Walking home in the pre-dawn darkness, counting the whopping $43 in tips I'd made, I felt like I was disappearing from the world one day at a time. My room felt smaller than usual that morning. The smell from the restaurant below seemed stronger, more nauseating. I was exhausted but too wired to sleep, too tired to think straight. That's when I decided to go through Grandpa's stuff one more time, maybe looking for some kind of answer I'd missed. I dumped everything from the box onto my bed with less care than I should have. The books scattered, the photographs spread out like a paper fan, and that old wallet landed with a soft thud that sounded final somehow. I picked it up, feeling its familiar weight, when something shifted inside. The wallet's lining had been loose for years. Grandpa always said he'd fix it someday, but never got around to it. Now, in my fumbling exhaustion, the fabric finally gave up the ghost. It tore just enough for something to slip out and flutter to the floor like a dying moth. A lottery ticket, crumpled, faded, and completely unremarkable. I stared at it for what felt like forever, trying to process why Grandpa would keep a losing lottery ticket in his wallet. The man who taught me that gambling was for suckers and hard work was the only sure bet I'd been carrying around a lottery ticket, like some kind of talisman. A lottery ticket? Seriously. I said out loud to my empty room, my voice dripping with sarcastic disbelief. Of all the things to find, this felt like the universe's idea of a sick joke. Here I was, broke and desperate. And my dead grandfather's big surprise was a piece of paper that probably wasn't worth the dollar he'd spent on it. I held it up to the light, squinting at the numbers through the dim glow of my bedside lamp. The date was from about 2 months before he died. The numbers meant nothing to me, just random digits that probably matched absolutely nothing in any drawing ever held. Another one of Grandpa's little quirks that I'd never understand. The ticket felt as worthless as everything else in my life at that moment. Just another reminder that even when people try to leave you something meaningful, it usually turns out to be another disappointment. Grandpa's funny little habits, his small rebellions against his own advice. This was probably just him buying $1 worth of hope every now and then. I was too tired to think about it anymore. Too tired to care about lottery tickets or family betrayal or the smell of grease that seemed permanently embedded in my clothes. I tossed the ticket onto my nightstand next to the wallet and the rest of Grandpa's treasures, then collapsed onto my bed without even taking off my shoes. As I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of the city waking up while I tried to sleep, I thought about what Grandpa used to say, "Life's got a funny way of surprising you, kiddo, usually when you least expect it." At the time, it sounded like old man wisdom. Now it just sounded like old man foolishness. The lottery ticket sat there on my nightstand like a silent witness to my failures. Just another piece of junk from a dead man's collection of junk, passed down to the family disappointment, who was too naive to know better. Grandpa's silly little gambles. This was the last thing I wanted to think about when I was barely scraping by myself. I closed my eyes and tried to forget about everything. The ticket, the job, the family that had ripped me off. Tomorrow would bring another shift at Mel's, another 8 hours of scrubbing away at other people's messes, while my own life stayed stuck in neutral. But sometimes the universe has other plans. Sometimes what looks like junk turns out to be treasure. Sometimes dead grandfathers know more about surprising their grandsons than anyone gives them credit for. Turns out, the old man had one last surprise up his sleeve, and it was about to change everything. I ignored that ticket for several days. It sat on my table like a silent reminder of Grandpa's passion for absurd little things. Funny how Grandpa bought lottery tickets so often, I thought they probably haunted his dreams. I was trying to focus on more pressing matters, like figuring out how to afford my next meal without selling a kidney. He used to say, "Opportunity exists as long as you're looking for it." Back then, it seemed like just another old man saying, the kind of wisdom that sounds profound until you're actually broke and desperate. But Grandpa had this way of dropping philosophical bombs disguised as casual conversation. The lottery ticket became part of my daily scenery, like the water stain on my ceiling, or the neighbor's cat that somehow kept getting into my room. Just another piece of clutter in a life that felt increasingly cluttered with disappointment. Every morning I'd see it there, this crumpled piece of paper that represented everything I thought was wrong with Grandpa's approach to money. My routine was pathetically simple. Wake up, stare at my bank account balance of $47.32, go to work, come home exhausted, repeat. The ticket witnessed this cycle day after day, probably judging me for being too practical to believe in random windfalls. Then came Tuesday night, or was it Wednesday morning? Time gets weird when you're working the graveyard shift at a place where the coffee tastes like regret and the fluorescent lights flicker like they're having seizures. I was in the middle of my usual routine, scraping dried ketchup off plates while questioning my life choices, when the radio in the kitchen started talking about something that made my brain short-circuit. The radio announcer's voice had been comfortable background noise to my mundane existence until I heard words that yanked me back into reality like a cold slap. Unclaimed prize of $85 million. Deadline to claim, just 21 days remaining. My hand stopped moving. The plate I was holding slipped back into the soapy water with a splash that seemed louder than it should have been. $85 million. The number hit me like a freight train carrying bags of money. I stood there in that greasy kitchen, surrounded by the smell of old cooking oil and broken dreams, while my brain tried to process what I'd just heard. The rational part of my mind, the part that had been trained by 18 years of disappointment, immediately started making excuses. Millions of people bought lottery tickets. The odds of Grandpa's random piece of paper being worth anything were astronomical. I was probably just torturing myself with impossible fantasies. But there was this other part of me, this tiny voice that sounded suspiciously like Grandpa, whispering that maybe, just maybe, the universe had decided to cut me some slack. I finished my shift in a daze, my hands moving automatically while my mind raced through possibilities that seemed too good to be true. The walk home felt different that night. The empty streets didn't seem as threatening. The broken streetlights didn't bother me as much. Even the smell from the dumpster behind the Chinese restaurant seemed less offensive. Everything looked the same, but something fundamental had shifted in my perception of the world. I practically ran up the stairs to my room, taking them two at a time like I was being chased by my own skepticism. The ticket was exactly where I'd left it, looking as unimpressive as ever. Just a piece of paper with some numbers on it. Nothing special about it except for the fact that it might be my ticket out of this nightmare. My hand was shaking as I picked it up, actually shaking, like I was defusing a bomb instead of reading a lottery ticket. The numbers were still there, faded but visible. 7, 14, 23, 35, 42, and the Powerball number 18. They meant nothing to me. Just random digits that Grandpa had chosen for reasons I'd never know. This was it, the moment of truth that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, not knowing if there was water below or jagged rocks. I pulled up the lottery website on my phone. My fingers fumbled with the screen, like I'd never used technology before. The internet connection in my building was slower than government bureaucracy, but eventually the winning numbers appeared. 7, check. 14, check. 23. My heart started beating faster. 35. This couldn't be happening. 42. The room started spinning. And the Powerball, 18. It was like being struck by lightning. Except instead of pain, I felt this fever of hope mixed with wild, almost paralyzing fear rushing through my veins. I grabbed that crumpled piece of paper, compared the numbers again, and the world around me seemed to pause, then start spinning at crazy speed. This was just paper, right? Just ink and false promises? But the numbers matched, every single one of them, perfectly. I must have checked those numbers 50 times, convinced I was hallucinating from too much exposure to dish soap fumes. But they kept matching. 7 times 7, 14 times 14. The numbers burned themselves into my retinas like I was staring at the sun. That's when reality hit me, like a sledgehammer to the chest. If this was real, if this wasn't some cruel joke the universe was playing on me, then I was holding $85 million in my trembling hands. 85 million reasons why my life was about to change in ways I couldn't even imagine. But then the fear kicked in. Real, bone-deep terror that made my previous worries about rent money seem like children's games. I'd heard stories about lottery winners, and they weren't all fairy tales with happy endings. Some people won the lottery and lost everything else. Their families, their friends, their sanity, sometimes their lives. I spent the next 3 hours falling down internet rabbit holes, reading horror stories about people who won big and ended up worse than when they started. Broke within 5 years. Murdered by family members. Kidnapped for ransom. Divorced and destroyed. The money was supposed to solve problems, not create new ones that made poverty look like a vacation. Grandpa's words kept echoing in my head. Money is a magnifying glass for character. It doesn't change who you are. It just shows everyone who you were all along. What would I become if this pile of paper turned out to be real? Would I turn into one of those cautionary tales I was reading about? Sleep was impossible. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, holding the ticket like it might disappear if I let go. Every car that drove by sounded like someone coming to steal my secret. Every footstep in the hallway sounded like danger approaching. Paranoia set in faster than I expected, and I hadn't even claimed the money yet. By morning, I knew I needed help. Professional help from someone who understood legal stuff and wouldn't try to steal my potential fortune. But I was an 18-year-old dishwasher with no connections and no idea how to find a trustworthy lawyer. For all I knew, most lawyers were just well-dressed sharks waiting to take advantage of idiots like me. That's when I remembered something Grandpa had mentioned years ago about helping out veterans who couldn't afford legal representation. He'd volunteered with some organization that provided free legal services to former military personnel. It was a long shot, but maybe they could point me in the right direction. The Veterans Legal Aid Society was located in a building that had seen better decades, wedged between a pawn shop and a place that claimed to buy gold but looked more like a front for something illegal. The receptionist was this no-nonsense woman in her 60s who looked like she'd heard every sob story ever invented. I explained my situation as vaguely as possible, said I needed legal advice about an inheritance issue, and mentioned Grandpa's name. Her expression softened when I told her about his volunteer work, and she made a phone call that changed everything. 20 minutes later, I was sitting across from Sarah Martinez, a lawyer who specialized in estate planning and financial privacy. Sarah was maybe 40, with gray streaks in her black hair and eyes that missed nothing. She had this calm, professional demeanor that made me feel like I wasn't completely insane for walking into a law office with a lottery ticket and a head full of paranoid fantasies. When I finally worked up the courage to tell her the whole story, her reaction surprised me. No gasping, no excitement, no dollar signs in her eyes. Just careful, methodical questions about dates and procedures and legal requirements. She treated my potential windfall like it was just another case, which somehow made it feel more real and less like a fever dream. Her advice was like a cold shower for my overheated imagination. Not a word to anyone, not even your closest friends or family. We'll establish a trust. It's your only shield against the chaos that comes with sudden wealth. Trusts are like armor, and believe me, I've seen what happens when people try to claim jackpots in their own name. She explained that our state allowed anonymous claims through properly structured trusts, which felt like the first piece of good luck I'd had in years. The process of verifying the ticket felt like performing surgery with an audience of skeptical doctors. Every step had to be documented, witnessed, and triple-checked. Sarah handled everything with the kind of professional competence that made me understand why Grandpa had respected the people at that veterans organization. We drove to the state lottery office in her sensible Honda Civic, the ticket secured in a manila envelope, like it contained nuclear launch codes. The building looked disappointingly normal for a place where dreams either came true or died horrible deaths. Just another government office with fluorescent lights and people who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. The lottery officials treated us with polite skepticism until they ran the ticket through their verification system. That's when their attitude shifted from bureaucratic boredom to carefully controlled excitement. Forms appeared from nowhere. Phones started ringing. Suddenly, everyone was very interested in making sure we understood the claiming process. The ticket was legitimate. The numbers matched. The timeline was valid. Barring any legal complications, I was about to become the recipient of $85 million, minus taxes, distributed over 30 years unless I chose the lump sum option. Sarah recommended the lump sum despite the reduced amount. Something about inflation and investment opportunities that made my head spin. We were scheduled to return in 2 weeks for the final verification and fund transfer. 2 weeks to process the fact that my life was about to change in ways I couldn't comprehend. 2 weeks to figure out how to handle more money than I'd ever imagined without losing my mind or my soul in the process. Walking out of that lottery office felt surreal, like I was floating instead of walking. The world looked exactly the same, but everything had changed. I was still the same broke dishwasher I'd been that morning, but now I was a broke dishwasher with a guaranteed future that involved more zeros than I could count. Sarah suggested we celebrate with coffee, so we ended up at this little cafe near her office where normal people talked about normal problems like mortgage payments and car repairs. I sat there sipping a latte that cost more than I usually spend on food in a day, trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. That's when I made the mistake of checking my phone. Social media had become a habit I couldn't break, even when my life was imploding or, apparently, exploding with good fortune. I was scrolling through the usual nonsense when something caught my eye that made my blood turn to ice water. My brother Jake had liked one of my old Instagram stories. Nothing unusual about that. We still followed each other despite the family drama, maintaining the pretense of brotherly connection through double taps and emoji reactions. But this particular like made my paranoid mind go into overdrive. The story was from a few weeks ago, just a random photo of my room with some joke about how glamorous my new life was. But now, looking at it with fresh eyes and a pocket full of secrets, I could see something in the background that made my stomach drop into my shoes. There, barely visible in the corner of the frame, was my nightstand. And on that nightstand, partially obscured by shadow but still recognizable, if you knew what to look for, was the edge of Grandpa's old wallet. The same wallet where the lottery ticket had been hidden until I'd accidentally discovered it. My mind started racing with terrifying possibilities. Could Jake see the wallet in the photo? Was the ticket visible? Had I somehow given away my secret without realizing it? The timestamp on his was from this morning, right around the time when lottery officials would have been verifying my ticket. Cold paranoia washed over me like a tide of ice water. Was it just coincidence? Jake liking old posts wasn't unusual. He sometimes went through social media when he was bored, randomly interacting with stuff from weeks or months ago. But the timing felt too perfect, too convenient to be random chance. Could someone know? Was it possible that my carefully guarded secret had already leaked out through something as stupid as a carelessly taken photograph? The thought that my family might already be aware of my windfall made me feel physically sick. I stared at my phone screen until the image burned into my retinas, trying to see what Jake might have seen, looking for any clue that might have given away the most important secret of my life. The photo was grainy, taken in bad light with an old phone, but there was definitely something on that nightstand that looked like it could be a wallet. Sarah noticed my distress and asked if everything was okay, but how could I explain that my whole carefully constructed plan might be falling apart because of a random social media interaction? How could I tell her that the brother who'd gotten everything while I got nothing might now know about the one thing that could change everything? The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire I couldn't put out. Does someone know? Had my secret already escaped before I'd even had a chance to properly claim it? Was I about to discover that keeping $85 million anonymous was going to be a lot harder than Sarah had made it sound? I sat in that cafe, surrounded by people living their normal lives, while my mind spiraled through scenarios that range from awkward family confrontations to elaborate schemes designed to separate me from my newfound fortune. The paranoia was probably irrational, but when you're holding that much potential wealth, rational thinking becomes a luxury you can't afford. The worst part was not knowing if Jake had seen something, not knowing if he'd told anyone, not knowing if my family was already making plans for money I hadn't even received yet. The uncertainty was almost worse than poverty had been, because at least when you're broke, you know exactly where you stand. Does someone know? That question was about to haunt my dreams and turn my lottery win into the most stressful experience of my life. And suddenly, being broke didn't seem like the worst thing anymore. I submitted the ticket anonymously through the trust. It was like playing spy games where my anonymity was the only armor I had, and my nerves were guitar strings stretched to the breaking point. The lottery confirmed the win, but there were still 30 days of verification ahead. 30 days that felt like 30 years, where each day was a minefield, and I was a blind bomb disposal expert. Sarah had been brilliant about the whole thing. Massachusetts usually required public announcement of winners, but she'd found this legal loophole that was pure genius. A special charitable trust that allowed anonymity if part of the funds went to charity. It was our shield against the chaos that would inevitably follow. Problem was, shields can be more fragile than you think. The first week passed without incident. I kept working at Mel's, scrubbing plates, and pretending my biggest worry was whether we'd run out of industrial soap. Nobody suspected that the dishwasher, who smelled like grease and broken dreams, was sitting on a fortune that could buy the entire restaurant chain. It felt surreal, living this double life where I was simultaneously the poorest and potentially richest person in any room. But paranoia has a way of eating you alive from the inside. Every conversation felt loaded with hidden meaning. Every glance from coworkers seemed suspicious. When Pete asked if I was feeling okay because I seemed distracted, I nearly jumped out of my skin like he'd caught me stealing from the register. The leak happened on day 9. 9 days of successful secrecy, and then everything went to hell faster than a greased pig at a county fair. Sarah called me at work, her usually calm voice tight with controlled panic. Someone had talked. Someone with access to lottery commission records had mentioned to someone else that there was an unusual charitable trust claim being processed. That someone else happened to be married to a local news reporter who specialized in human interest stories. The connection was traced back to Tom Bradley, a guy who worked in the Lottery Commission's verification department and apparently owed money to half the city. He'd mentioned the large anonymous claim to his bookie, try and convince the guy that big money was flowing through the system and his own debts weren't that significant by comparison. The bookie mentioned it to his wife, who worked at a local television station, and suddenly my carefully constructed anonymity was crumbling like a house of cards in a hurricane. Sarah explained all this with a kind of professional detachment that made me understand why lawyers charge so much money. She was already working on damage control, but the cat was essentially out of the bag and running wild through the neighborhood. The first news report hit that evening. Channel 7's investigative team had somehow connected the charitable trust to Grandpa's estate and from there to me. They didn't have my name yet, but they had enough pieces to make educated guesses. The reporter, a perfectly coed woman who looked like she practiced her concerned expressions in the mirror, called it a mysterious windfall that raises questions about family inheritance and lottery transparency. I watched the broadcast from my tiny room, feeling like I was observing my own execution. They showed file footage of the lottery office, interviewed some expert about trust law, and speculated about potential family disputes surrounding large inheritance claims. It was like watching someone dissect my life with surgical precision while I was still alive. That's when my phone started buzzing. Text messages from numbers I didn't recognize. Friend requests on social media from people I'd never met. My landlord knocked on my door asking if everything was okay because there were some reporters asking questions downstairs. The vultures had found their prey, and they were circling. The worst part was the waiting. Waiting for the other shoe to drop. Waiting for someone to put all the pieces together and splash my name across headlines. Waiting for my family to see the news and realize that their discarded son had stumbled into the kind of fortune they'd spent their lives dreaming about. I didn't have to wait long. The next morning brought a knock on my door that sounded different from my landlord's polite tapping. This was aggressive, insistent, the kind of knocking that said, "We know you're in there and we're not leaving." I looked through the peephole and saw 3 faces that made my stomach drop into my shoes. Mom, Dad, and Jake. They'd throw me out like trash. Now they wanted to recycle me into their golden goose. Standing in my hallway like they owned the place, their expressions ranged from fake concern to barely concealed rage, and I knew immediately that they connected the dots. Somehow, someway, they'd figure out that their throwaway son had won the lottery jackpot they'd probably dreamed about their entire lives. The confrontation that followed was like watching a 3-act play about human greed disguised as family concern. They didn't knock politely or ask come in. They pushed past me like they were entering their own house, claiming moral authority they'd forfeited when they threw me out with Grandpa's junk. Their performance was Academy Award worthy. Mom played the heartbroken mother who couldn't understand how her son could keep such important news from his family. Dad took the role of the wounded patriarch, whose authority had been challenged by an ungrateful child. Jake just stood there looking like someone had stolen his birthday cake and given it to the family dog. They accused me of stealing inheritance that belonged to all of us by right of blood. They claimed Grandpa would be devastated to know I was keeping family money away from the people who truly deserved it. The hypocrisy was so thick you could cut it with a butter knife and serve it at Sunday dinner. But here's what really got to me. They genuinely seemed to believe their own performance. In their minds, I really was a villain in this story. The ungrateful child who'd stolen food from his starving siblings. Never mind that they'd throw me out. Never mind that they'd dismiss Grandpa's belongings as worthless trash. In their revised version of history, I was the monster. Dad's words hit like physical blows. I was selfish, ungrateful, a thief who was profiting off a dead man's memory. Mom cried, actual tears that seemed real enough, about how disappointed Grandpa would be if he knew I was hoarding family wealth. Jake just kept shaking his head like he was witnessing a tragedy instead of a lottery win. The emotional manipulation was surgical in its precision. They knew exactly which buttons to push, which guilt trips would hit hardest. They'd had 18 years to perfect their techniques, and they deployed every weapon in their arsenal with the skill of professional emotional terrorists. That's when I remembered something Grandpa used to say: money doesn't change people. It just reveals who they always were. Looking at my family, really looking at them, I saw the truth of those words written across their faces. Here they were, ready to tear me apart for something they'd literally thrown away. The same people who called Grandpa's belongings junk were now claiming sacred family ownership of the jackpot that came from that junk. The irony was so perfect, it would have been funny if it wasn't destroying my life. These were my relatives in all their glory, prepared to rip me to shreds for something they'd once considered worthless. Their greed was showing like slip under a dress, impossible to hide and embarrassing to witness. But the worst was still coming. Within hours of their visit, my story was all over local news. Someone, probably one of them, had leaked my name to reporters. The narrative they spun was devastating. Ungrateful grandson steals family inheritance, refuses to share lottery windfall with struggling relatives who help raise him. The media ate it up like candy. Every headline was a knife in my back. Every news report painted me as the villain in a story about family betrayal and inherited greed. I became the poster child for everything wrong with sudden wealth. The selfish kid who forgot where he came from the moment money appeared. Social media was even worse. Comment sections turned into lynch mobs calling for my head. People who'd never met me or my family had strong opinions about my character and what I deserved. I was trending on Twitter as ungrateful lottery winner, and the memes were brutal. My face was photoshopped onto pictures of Scrooge McDuck swimming in gold coins. The harassment extended beyond the internet. Reporters camped outside my building. Strangers approached me on the street with opinions about my moral failures. Someone threw a rock through my window with a note calling me a family-destroying monster. I became a national symbol of ingratitude and greed, all because I'd accidentally found a lottery ticket in my dead grandfather's wallet. Every headline felt like a punch to the gut. Every comment thread was a knife between my ribs. I'd become America's favorite villain, the ungrateful monster who wouldn't share his lottery winnings with a family that had supposedly loved and supported him his entire life. The truth didn't matter. The narrative had already been written, and I was cast as the antagonist. The stress was eating me alive from the inside. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't go anywhere without being recognized and judged. Fame turned out to be a special kind of hell when everyone famous for being hated. I understood why some lottery winners ended up worse off than when they started. But then Sarah called with news that changed everything. She'd been digging through digital archives, looking for anything that might support my version of events. What she found was better than gold. Email records from the estate settlement that painted a very different picture of family dynamics. The emails were damning evidence of my family's true feelings about Grandpa's belongings. Dad had written to the estate lawyer, explicitly stating that he wanted all the old man's junk disposed of as quickly as possible. There were texts between family members making jokes about Grandpa's worthless collection and suggesting they should just dump everything at Goodwill. When Sarah showed me those emails, I felt invisible chains falling off my shoulders like I was being released from prison. This wasn't just evidence. This was vindication. Proof that I wasn't a thief, wasn't a liar, wasn't the monster they'd painted me to be. I was just a kid who'd inherited something his family had literally thrown away, then won a lottery with a ticket they considered garbage. Sarah's smile when she handed me the printed emails was triumphant, like a prosecutor who just found the smoking gun that would exonerate an innocent man. She knew these documents would change everything, shift the entire narrative from family betrayal to family greed and hypocrisy. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe properly. The truth was finally going to come out. The real story of what happened would replace the manufactured outrage and false accusations. My family's greed and contradictions would be exposed for everyone to see, and maybe, just maybe, people would understand that I wasn't the villain in this story. But the universe has a twisted sense of humor when it comes to timing. Just when victory seemed within reach, just when the truth was about to set me free, my family made their final, most devastating move. They filed a lawsuit. Not just any lawsuit, but an emergency injunction that froze all lottery payments pending resolution of their inheritance claim. They argued that the lottery ticket was part of Grandpa's estate and should be subject to normal inheritance distribution. Their lawyer, some shark they'd hired on contingency, convinced a judge that there were legitimate questions about ownership that needed to be resolved before any money changed hands. As Sarah told me later, emergency injunctions can freeze everything, even truth. Everything stopped. The trust was frozen. The lottery payments were suspended. My entire future was suddenly locked up in legal limbo, while lawyers argued about technicalities, and judges decided whether my family had any legitimate claim to money they'd once considered worthless. It felt like the universe had decided to play the cruelest possible joke on my hopes. Here I was, 30 days away from financial freedom, with proof of my family's hypocrisy in hand, and suddenly everything was frozen again. Time started working against me instead of for me, each day bringing new legal complications instead of bringing me closer to resolution. The irony was devastating. I'd gone from broke dishwasher to lottery winner to frozen lottery winner, all in the span of a month. My family had managed to snatch defeat from the jaws of their own victory, turning what should have been their embarrassing exposure into another chance to torment me with uncertainty and delay. Everything was stopped. Again, like the universe had decided to joke around with my hope, ripping it from my hands at the last possible moment, just 30 days before the payout. Time had started working against me. The courtroom is a place where emotions hide behind dry facts, and human dramas get transformed into legal case studies. But for me, it was a gladiator arena disguised as a courthouse, where fate came dressed in legal briefs. And my family's fate, too, though I didn't realize that yet. The silence in the room was so loud, I thought I could hear my own heartbeat, while the sound of the ceiling fan echoed in my ears like a countdown timer. Walking into that courthouse felt like entering a different dimension where truth became a commodity lawyers traded back and forth. The marble floors gleamed under fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly sick, and the whole place smelled like old with polish and nervous sweat. This was American justice in action, where right and wrong got measured in precedence and procedure instead of common sense. My family's performance was Academy Award caliber. Dad played the exhausted patriarch with his tired eyes and slumped shoulders, looking like a man who'd been betrayed by his own flesh and blood. Mom had perfected the soap opera crying technique, complete with a perfectly prepared handkerchief that appeared at exactly the right dramatic moments. Jake just stood there playing the innocent victim who'd sacrificed everything for family unity. Their lawyer was this slick guy in an expensive suit who probably charged more per hour than I used to make in a month. He painted a picture of family values and sacred inheritance, talking about how Grandpa's lottery ticket represented the hopes and dreams of an entire bloodline. The hypocrisy was so thick you could serve it at Thanksgiving dinner. They talked about family values and honoring Grandpa's memory, while conveniently forgetting they'd thrown his belongings in the trash like yesterday's newspaper. It was so hypocritical I wanted to laugh and cry at the same time, like watching a bad comedy where you're somehow the main character. Their selective memory about family loyalty was more flexible than a yoga instructor. The judge listened with the kind of professional patience that comes from hearing every possible variation of human greed and family dysfunction. She was a stern-looking woman in her 60s who probably dealt with more family drama than a reality TV producer. Her expression gave nothing away, but her eyes suggested she'd seen this exact same story played out 100 times before. That's when Sarah dropped her bombshell. She'd found those emails I mentioned earlier, the digital trail that proved my family's real feelings about Grandpa's possessions. Dad's own words, written in black and white. Take all the old man's junk. I don't want any of it. Text messages joking about disposing of Grandpa's worthless collection at Goodwill. The shift in the courtroom was immediate and dramatic. My family's lawyer suddenly looked like he was trying to swallow a live fish. Dad's face went through several colors that don't exist in nature. Mom stopped crying so abruptly, it was like someone had turned off a faucet. Jake just stared at the evidence like it was written in a foreign language. But then Sarah leaned in and delivered a line that split me right down the middle. We can offer a settlement. Give them 10% and they'll drop the lawsuit. Your choice. It wasn't just a proposal. It was a psychological earthquake that cracked my foundation and forced me to choose who I wanted to become. It felt like I was standing inside a Robert Frost poem, only both roads were paved with dollar signs. Revenge. Make them feel the same pain they caused me. Show them who the real winner was. Or mercy. Rise above their pettiness and not let money turn me into the monster they claimed I already was. My inner voice was screaming for blood. Make them hurt like they hurt you. But somewhere in the back of my mind, I could hear Grandpa's calm, wise voice from years of fishing trips and life lessons. Don't waste your life on petty revenge, kiddo. Fight for what's yours, but don't lose yourself in the process. Otherwise, you'll become just like the people who hurt you. That memory hit me like a lightning bolt of clarity. I could see 8-year-old me sitting on the dock behind Grandpa's house, learning to tie fishing knots while he shared the kind of wisdom that only makes sense when you're older. He'd always been more interested in teaching character than catching fish. Then came the second twist that changed everything. During a recess, Sarah had done some more digging and discovered the real reason behind my family's desperation. Dad hadn't just made bad financial decisions. He'd gambled the family's entire savings trying to save Jake's failing tech startup. They weren't just greedy. They were drowning in debt and grasping for any lifeline they could find. Suddenly I saw them differently. Not as monsters, but as scared, confused people who'd painted themselves into a corner like rats in a maze. It didn't excuse their actions, but it made them more human, more understandable. They were victims of their own greed and poor choices, struggling in quicksand of their own making. That's when I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. Instead of offering them cash, I proposed something completely different. Jobs. Real employment with my future business ventures, complete with contracts and clear expectations. It was about dignity, not charity. It was about giving them a chance to earn their way back, instead of just handing them money. Their reaction was priceless. The confusion on their faces was like watching people try to solve calculus problems written in crayon. Who do you think you are? Was written all over their expressions. They couldn't understand how their throwaway son had somehow become the person offering them opportunities, instead of begging for acceptance. But the judge had heard enough testimony and seen enough evidence. The moment of truth arrived like a slow-motion explosion, each word falling like a hammer blow that would carve my destiny in stone. She cleared her throat, that official sound that means decision time, and began reading her verdict. The lottery ticket legally transferred to plaintiff, according to all gift and inheritance statutes. A pause. The lawsuit is dismissed. Her words hit the courtroom like thunder on a clear day. For my family, it was devastating. For me, it was a quiet but deep exhale of relief. Justice had been served. My kind of justice. The shock on my family's faces was total and complete. They looked like they'd been hit by a truck carrying bags of disbelief. Dad's mouth hung open like a broken mailbox. Mom's tears stopped flowing so suddenly it was almost comical. Jake just stared at the judge like she'd announced that gravity had been canceled. Their lawyers started gathering papers with the frantic energy of someone trying to clean up after a natural disaster. The whole courtroom felt the shift in power dynamics, like watching a chess game where someone had just moved their queen into checkmate position. I received the check 3 weeks later. It wasn't just a pile of numbers on paper. It was a ticket to a completely new life. Money is a tool, not a goal, Grandpa always said. And for me, this was never about revenge or showing off. This was about proving that Grandpa's faith in me wasn't misplaced, and proving to myself that I could believe in my own potential. The check was heavier than I expected, not because of the paper, but because of the weight of responsibility it represented. This wasn't just $85 million. This was $85 million worth of possibilities, opportunities, and dreams. Plus, Sarah had handled all the tax obligations immediately, because that's what competent lawyers do. The first thing I did was enroll at MIT, not because I wanted to show off my newfound wealth, but because I'd always dreamed of studying there and finally had the means to make it happen. I paid for my education myself, and it felt like more than just tuition payments. Each semester was a personal symbol of victory, over poverty, over betrayal, over doubt, over everything that had tried to break me. College was different when you weren't worried about student loans or working 3 jobs to afford ramen noodles. I could focus on learning instead of surviving, and it opened up mental space I never knew I had. My classmates had no idea about my lottery win. I was just another student trying to figure out engineering and life simultaneously. But the real dream was always a cafe. Grandpa's booth became my tribute to the man who believed in me when nobody else would. I wanted to create something that would capture his spirit and values while building a business that actually mattered to people. The cafe smelled like fresh ground coffee and possibility. Old vinyl records crackled softly in the background, playing the kind of music Grandpa used to hum while working in his garage. The walls were covered with photographs from his travels and quotes from his homespun wisdom. The menu featured Grandpa's apple turnovers and Grandma's coffee, recipes I'd found in his old notebook. Every detail echoed Grandpa, from the vinyl crackle to the scent of apple turnovers. It was my way of saying thank you to him. Thanks, Grandpa. I didn't let you down. The cafe became a living memorial that served great coffee and created jobs instead of just gathering dust on a shelf. Part of the profits went to a scholarship fund for students from low-income families. I remember what it felt like to be 18 and broke with big dreams and no resources. If I could help other kids avoid that particular kind of desperation, then the money was serving a purpose bigger than just making me comfortable. Then one day, like something out of an old comedy, they showed up, my parents and Jake, looking like characters from a previous life, asking for work. I'd honestly prepared myself for something worse. Tears, accusations, dramatic confrontations. Instead, I saw something different in their eyes. Despair mixed with exhaustion, like they'd finally run out of other options. The conversation was awkward, but surprisingly civil. They didn't apologize exactly, but they didn't attack either. They just looked tired, like people who'd been fighting a war and finally realized they were on the wrong side. Dad looked older, Mom seemed smaller, and Jake had lost that cocky confidence that used to define him. I gave them a chance, not as charity, but as an opportunity to prove they could contribute something meaningful. You want to work here? Prove you care about something other than what you can take. I told them. It was the hardest form of forgiveness I'd ever attempted, because forgiveness isn't really about the other person. It's about freeing yourself from carrying their mistakes around like a backpack full of rocks. They took the jobs. Dad worked in inventory management. Mom handled customer service. And Jake learned to make coffee drinks without complaining about the uniform. Watching them adapt to being employees instead of family members demanding inheritance was educational for everyone involved. 6 months later, while going through some of Grandpa's belongings that had become treasures instead of junk, I made a discovery that changed everything one final time. Hidden in his old wallet, the same wallet where I'd found the lottery ticket, was a tiny note tucked under one of the inner pockets. The paper was yellowed and fragile, covered in Grandpa's careful handwriting. The message was short but devastating in its simplicity. This isn't about money. It's about believing in yourself. Gee. I smiled through tears. That exactly the kind of thing he'd say, short, blunt, and truer than truth. Reading those words felt like receiving a final hug from beyond the grave. It was confirmation that Grandpa had known exactly what he was doing when he kept that lottery ticket in his wallet. This was a random chance or a lucky accident. It was a carefully planned lesson about self-worth and potential wrapped up in a lottery ticket. The note proved what I'd suspected all along. Grandpa's real inheritance wasn't money. It was confidence. He'd given me the tools to believe in myself when everyone else had given up on me. The lottery ticket was just a delivery method for a much more valuable gift. But Grandpa always did love leaving little mysteries behind. As I continued sorting through his papers, documents I now preserved like historical artifacts, I found several more old lottery receipt stubs tucked away in various hiding spots. Some were from the same time period as my winning ticket. Others were older. A smile spread across my face as I realized the implications. Grandpa had been playing the lottery more systematically than anyone realized. He'd probably bought multiple tickets over the years, Maybe even won smaller amounts he'd never mentioned. The man who taught me that gambling was for suckers had apparently been running his own private lottery strategy. I looked at those receipt stubs and thought about all the lessons Grandpa had taught me, all the wisdom he'd shared during those fishing trips and garage projects. He'd always known how to leave an impression that lasted long after he was gone. These receipts weren't just paper. They were evidence of hope, persistence, and the kind of long-term thinking that most people never develop. The possibility that there might be more surprises hidden in Grandpa's past made me realize this story was probably far from over. Maybe there were other lottery tickets waiting to be discovered. Maybe there were other life lessons wrapped up in seemingly random purchases and forgotten hiding places. As I sat in my cafe, watching my family work alongside employees who become like a second family, I understood what Grandpa had really given me. It wasn't just financial security. It was a knowledge that I could survive anything, rebuild from nothing, and create something meaningful from whatever life handed me. The lottery ticket had been important. But the real prize was learning to believe in myself when everyone else had written me off. Money amplifies who you already are, and Grandpa had made sure I knew who I wanted to become before the amplification began. But as I held those additional lottery receipt stubs, one thought kept running through my mind. If Grandpa had been this strategic about hope and possibility, what other surprises had he left behind? What other lessons were waiting to be discovered in the boxes and belongings I'd once considered worthless? Looking at the evidence of his systematic approach to chance and opportunity, I realized this probably wasn't the end of our story together. It felt more like the end of chapter 1 in a much longer book about family, forgiveness, and the unexpected ways people show love across generations. This definitely wasn't over. In fact, I had the feeling it was just getting started. Grandpa always said the best stories are the ones that make you want to know what happens next. And sitting there in my cafe, surrounded by his photographs and memories, holding evidence of his continued influence on my life, I couldn't wait to discover what he had planned for Chapter 2. After all, the old man had already surprised me once. What were the odds he wouldn't do it again? And from the back of the cafe, the record crackled again, Grandpa's favorite blues tune, humming like a ghost still teaching me how to live.